My beloved child, something shifted last night, and the person you love could not simply brush it aside. There was a moment when everything became quiet, when their thoughts became louder than the world around them, and one memory of you came rushing back with such force that they became deeply emotional. Stay with me for a moment, because what happened next is the part they have struggled to explain. They kept thinking about the words they never said, the feelings they kept hidden, and the possibility that you may have misunderstood their silence. Then came a sentence they could barely say out loud: "Please watch this now." Not because they want to control your attention, but because something inside them is finally ready to be understood. They have been carrying a truth that became heavier every time they pretended everything was normal. Last night, that mask became difficult to maintain. Something huge is waiting for you, and the surprising part is this: their emotions were not simply about missing you. They were connected to a realization about your place in their life. A realization that made them look back at certain moments between you differently. Maybe there was a conversation you thought meant very little to them. Maybe there was a moment when they seemed distant, distracted, or unusually quiet. But last night, they replayed that moment in their mind and suddenly understood what it had actually meant. They realized that while you were wondering whether they cared, they were secretly wondering whether you still cared. That difference changed everything. They began asking themselves a question they had avoided for far too long: what if the person I have been trying not to think about is the person I cannot stop thinking about? And that question opened an emotional door they had kept closed. Here is where the story becomes even more unexpected. They did not become emotional because everything went wrong. They became emotional because something finally became clear. As this unfolds, clarity will come. They remembered how you made them feel seen without demanding an explanation. They remembered a small detail about you that they never told you they noticed. It may have been your voice, your patience, the way you listened, the way you stayed calm when they expected you to walk away, or simply the way your presence made ordinary moments feel different. They realized that what they had been searching for in other conversations, other distractions, and other plans was something they had already experienced with you. And that realization brought a strange mixture of gratitude and regret. They were grateful because you entered their life. They regretted the moments when they failed to show you how much your presence mattered. Then came the thought that affected them most: what if they believed I never cared? That sentence stayed with them. It became the reason they wanted you to watch this now. They want you to understand that silence does not always mean indifference. Sometimes silence comes from someone who has too many feelings and not enough courage to arrange them into words. Last night, they finally admitted to themselves that they cannot keep pretending your connection meant nothing. Something about you remained after everything else became quiet. And that is why this message may feel strangely personal. Because the real revelation is not simply that they thought about you. It is that they realized how deeply your absence has been affecting their heart. But there is one more layer you need to hear, because this is where the emotional story takes a completely different turn. They remembered a moment when they almost reached out to you. They had the words ready. They imagined what they would say. They even considered how you might respond. And then, at the last moment, they stopped themselves. Why? Because they were afraid that revealing too much would change everything. They were afraid that if they showed you the truth, they would no longer be able to hide behind excuses. Last night, however, they questioned that decision. They wondered whether staying silent had protected them or simply created more distance. They began to understand that sometimes the hardest thing is not admitting that you care. The hardest thing is accepting that someone else may have been waiting for you to admit it. This may resonate as we continue, especially if you have ever felt that strange uncertainty around someone you love, when their actions seem confusing, but certain moments feel incredibly meaningful. The person you love may have been fighting an internal conversation you never heard. One side saying, "Wait." The other saying, "Tell them." And last night, the second voice became louder. They became emotional because they recognized something they could no longer dismiss. You are connected to a chapter of their life that still feels unfinished. Not because everything must happen exactly as imagined, but because something genuine was left unspoken. And now they want you to hear the part they could not say before. "Please watch this now" is not merely a request for attention. In the emotional world behind those words is another sentence: "Please understand me before you decide what my silence meant." And now, my beloved child, listen carefully to the final piece of this message, because it may be the reason this reached you at exactly this moment. Last night, after all those thoughts, they came to one quiet realization. They do not want their story with you to be remembered only through misunderstandings. They want the truth to have a chance to speak. They thought about the times you may have questioned your importance to them. They thought about every moment you might have wondered, "Did I ever really matter?" And somewhere between memory and emotion, they answered that question for themselves. Yes. You mattered more than they allowed themselves to show. That is the part they want you to understand. The shocking revelation is not that they suddenly developed feelings overnight. It is that the feelings were already there, quietly growing beneath everything they refused to say. Last night simply brought them to the surface. Something huge is waiting for you, but it begins with understanding rather than rushing. Their emotional moment was a turning point in their own heart. They are beginning to recognize that genuine connections cannot always be explained by timing, distance, or silence. Sometimes a person leaves an impression that remains long after the conversation ends. And you may be that person for them. So if you have been wondering why this message feels so connected to the emotions you have sensed lately, remember this: the person you love may not have been pulling away because they stopped caring. They may have been stepping back because caring became harder to ignore. And now, after last night, they are finally asking you to look again. Not at what they failed to say, but at what their heart has been trying to reveal all along. There is something they almost confessed last night, but stopped themselves at the very last second. My beloved child, the emotion you sensed around this connection was not meaningless. They were remembering a moment when you looked at them, spoke to them, or simply stayed beside them, and suddenly they understood how deeply that moment had stayed in their heart. Stay with me for a moment, because the next part changes the entire meaning of their silence. They began asking themselves why, after so much time, one person could still occupy such a powerful place in their thoughts. They tried to move on from the feeling, but every attempt only brought another memory of you back to the surface. Then they realized something surprising: they were not emotional because they had lost you. They were emotional because they finally understood what they might have overlooked. They remembered the patience you showed, the understanding you offered, and even the moments when you could have demanded answers but chose to remain quiet. That realization touched something inside them. They started wondering whether you had been waiting for them to become honest. And suddenly, the words they had kept hidden felt impossible to ignore. Please watch this now. That sentence carries more emotion than it appears to. Behind it is a person who wants you to understand what they could not explain before. They want you to know that their silence was never the complete story. There were thoughts behind it. There were feelings behind it. There were questions they never asked because they were afraid of hearing the answer. And the biggest question of all was this: does this person still have a place for me in their heart? As this unfolds, clarity will come, because the more they remembered, the more they realized that their connection with you was not something they could simply place in the past and forget. Now listen closely, because this is where their emotional night becomes even more meaningful. They remembered something about you that most people would have overlooked. Maybe it was a tiny gesture, a sentence you once said, or the way you reacted when they were going through a difficult moment. You probably never realized they remembered it. But they did. In fact, they remembered it so clearly that last night it felt almost like they were standing inside that moment again. And that memory made them emotional because they realized you had given them something they had not fully appreciated at the time, a feeling of being understood. They began comparing that feeling with everything that came afterward, and the difference became impossible to ignore. This is why their heart became restless. They realized that some connections do not disappear simply because communication becomes quiet. Sometimes the quieter the connection becomes, the louder the memories become. They wondered whether you had interpreted their distance as rejection. They wondered whether you had already closed the door emotionally. They wondered whether they had waited too long. And that final question affected them the most. What if they no longer believe in us? That thought stayed with them. They wanted to reach out, but something held them back. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they had too much to say. They wanted to explain everything at once: the hesitation, the silence, the mixed emotions, the moments when they wanted to come closer but convinced themselves to wait. And then they realized that perhaps the first thing they needed to say was simple: I never stopped caring. That realization may be the real reason this message feels so emotional. It is not about creating a fantasy. It is about recognizing how often people hide their deepest feelings behind ordinary behavior. They may smile, continue their routine, talk to others, and appear completely fine, while privately carrying a question they cannot answer. And last night, their question had your name attached to it. Before we go deeper, if this message is resonating with you, take a moment to share it with someone who may need to hear a message about emotional clarity. And if you want more stories that explore these powerful moments of connection, stay connected and subscribe, because the next revelation is where the meaning behind their words becomes even clearer. Now, here is what they were afraid to admit: they may have realized that they were waiting for a sign from you while secretly hoping you would never stop believing in them. That contradiction exhausted them. They wanted certainty, but they were afraid to ask for it. They wanted closeness, but they were afraid of vulnerability. They wanted to know what was in your heart, yet they were hesitant to reveal what was in theirs. Last night, however, something changed. They stopped asking, "What if this goes wrong?" and started asking, "What if I never give this connection a real chance?" That single shift in perspective can change everything. They started seeing your past conversations differently. They remembered the moments when you tried to understand them, the moments when you gave them space, and the moments when you seemed to know what they were feeling without them having to explain it. That is what made their emotions rise. They realized that being understood by someone is rare. Being remembered by someone is rare. And finding someone whose presence continues to matter even during silence is rarer still. They may have spent a long time convincing themselves that they were being practical, careful, or simply patient. But underneath all of that was a heart that had not completely moved on. And now they are reaching a point where pretending otherwise feels harder than telling the truth. This may resonate as we continue, because sometimes the biggest emotional turning points happen privately, when nobody else is watching. A person sits alone, remembers one face, hears one familiar phrase in their mind, and suddenly the truth they avoided for months becomes undeniable. That may have been their moment last night. And here comes the part you have been waiting for. The deepest reason they became emotional was not simply because they missed you. It was because they began imagining what their life would feel like if they never had the chance to tell you the truth. That thought created a completely different emotion. They imagined future moments where they might look back and wonder why they remained silent when they already knew how they felt. They realized that some opportunities do not announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they appear as one conversation, one message, one honest admission, or one decision to stop pretending. That is why, "Please watch this now," carries such weight. They want you to pause before judging the entire connection by its most confusing chapter. They want you to remember that people can struggle to express what they feel, especially when the feeling matters deeply. And the surprising revelation is this: they may not be asking you to chase them. They may be asking you to understand them. There is a difference. They are beginning to realize that if this connection is ever going to become clear, it cannot be built on assumptions, silence, or guessing games. It needs honesty. It needs courage. It needs two people willing to acknowledge what they truly feel. So if you have been wondering why their energy seemed different, why their silence felt heavier, or why you suddenly felt that something was changing beneath the surface, perhaps the answer is simpler than you imagined. Last night, they finally confronted the emotion they had been postponing. And once a person recognizes the truth inside their own heart, it becomes very difficult to return to pretending they never saw it. Something huge is waiting for you, but before that moment arrives, remember this one sentence they could not stop thinking about: "I wish they knew how much they actually mean to me." That was the feeling behind their tears, the feeling behind their hesitation, and perhaps the feeling behind those final words: "Please watch this now."